Hello and welcome to Wessex Museums' first ever podcast series, Interrogating Hardy. This series we will be focusing on Thomas Hardy and if he is the unique hero we, or at least I, would like to think of him as. My name is Harriet Still and I am the Wessex Museums Hardy curator as well as being the host of this podcast. This aptly named podcast series will question how far his writing did speak about multiple issues, if writing alone was enough to call him an activist, and how this can reflect our own time. Hello everyone, today's episode of Interrogating Hardy will assess Hardy and his views on the ancient landscape. But first of all, before we get into it, I'd like to introduce you to our two lovely guests for today. We have Jack, who studied archaeology at the University of Bristol, and the lovely Glyn Coy, who is known for his evocative photography of the Wiltshire landscape, as well as his podcast, Hidden Wiltshire. And so we'll be bringing Thomas Hardy and his views on ancient places into the modern day. So welcome. So lovely to be joined by you both today.
Pleasure to be here.
Yes, nice to be here on another podcast.
Wonderful. It's lovely to have you with us here. So just to set the scene, I'm going to start this episode with Thomas Hardy's quote that he said when he went to visit Stonehenge in 1897. So by this time he was about 57 years old. He'd written Tessa d'Urberville's with that incredible scene with Tess lying on the altar stone in the middle of Stonehenge. And he said of Stonehenge, the misfortune of ruins is to be beheld nearly always at noonday by visitors and not at twilight. I think Hardy, throughout his writings, really creates these very, very evocative senses of ancient places, especially at really kind of poignant times of day, like in the middle of the night or by moonlight or just as the sun is rising. Also, throughout the rest of his life, he was quite vocal in trying to protect these sites and trying to keep them accessible for the general public, as well as entering into the debates that were coming about from people like the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings and the way they were raising questions about how these sites should be preserved and accessed in future. And so Hardy gets involved in all of that. And I suppose the angle I'm coming at with this episode is, was Hardy particularly provocative or trailblazing in the way that he engaged with these ancient sites and these old buildings, both within his literature and in his life? Or actually, is he quite run-of-the-mill every day? Was this going on everywhere at this point? And so, first of all, I just wanted to ask quite a kind of personal thing of how do you feel about ancient sites in terms of what Hardy said about misfortune of ruins to be beheld nearly always at noonday by the visitor?
It's quite an interesting quote to lead in with, because he definitely ties in his idea of these ancient places to a sort of view of mysticism and sort of like a primordial Britain, which was quite popular at the mid and in the late 18th century even, but throughout the 19th century there's this sort of developing idea of prehistoric Britain as something quite mystical and magical, and at these sort of like midnight moonlight times strange rituals will occur, and he sort of implants this on these ancient monuments as sort of his view, and it was a view quite commonly shared by quite a few other antiquarians and archaeologists coming out of this period. We obviously know a lot more about these places now and can better understand the story, but it's kind of quite nicely set in the views of quite a few others, this like sort of long developing idea about these monuments, and the sort of comment about them being viewed at midday rather than these special times. I think that's quite poignant now when we go to some of these sites like Stonehenge, and they're these sort of tourist attractions, very busy. You've got buses going up and down to the stones, and these aren't monuments as they would have appeared in the past, but they are they're different, and these monuments evolve. So yes, he's in some ways right about that. These monuments were never, inverted commas, supposed to be viewed like this, but we have what we have now, and these monuments have changed. But I think it's a really interesting quote that he leads in with there.
And Glyn, do you have any moments that you've viewed ancient ruins and felt that they were best viewed by midnight rather than the middle of the day?
Yeah, I mean, Stonehenge is a good example because when it's during opening hours, of course, it's very busy. But something I do around this time of year, especially when the nights are light for much longer, is walk up to Stonehenge at, say, 9 o'clock at night. And as you do that, you're approaching it when there's nobody in the landscape. And I've had Stonehenge to myself at that time of night. And I know there are other photographers who go there during the night and take nighttime photography when there's no people around. So yes, Stonehenge is very busy when it's open, but it's also still accessible, at strange times. And you do get a much stronger sense of the mystical nature of it when you're there on your own. But as well as that, there are plenty of sites, particularly in Wiltshire on my patch. And I cover, my strapline is Hidden Wiltshire because I go to the places that aren't so well known. And there's so many ancient sites in Wiltshire that are really not visited by many people at all and still very accessible. And you can get a sense of landscape and history and, try and place yourself in the past. Of course, what you're seeing is nothing like what they were back in the day, but you see them as they are now, and you're able to kind of position them in the landscape in a new way, and often happen to yourself while you do so.
Because I think it's quite interesting that when Hardy was researching for Test of the D'Urbervilles, he said that he not only visited Stonehenge, but he actually cycled there, which I'm really impressed by, because even driving to Stonehenge from my neck of the woods down in Dorset feels quite a reach. So the idea of cycling there just, for me, is above and beyond the call of duty for a bit of research for a novel. But he says that he really enjoyed cycling there at night, and there was a definite feel, a kind of different sense of it. And also that the wind made a strange humming noise through the stones if you caught them at the right time of night. But of course, this, as I understand it, that there's a charabanc that starts doing shuttle runs between Salisbury Station and Stonehenge around the end of the 19th century. And so suddenly it goes from being this kind of really out of the way place in the 18th century that people stumble across, and you get Turner and Constable showing it as being the middle of nowhere, to suddenly being a place that has kind of this proto-tourist industry building up around it. And that interesting thing about how does it affect it is part of the joy of going at different times of day. Is it, I suppose, like Jack was saying, almost keying into some kind of primordial medieval world where you've got also that sense of being clocked into the kind of astronomical and cosmological surroundings, and that idea of humans wanting to reach out further than just the little world they live in into the kind of greater universe. And how much of it is also part of whether there's a kind of move at the end of the 19th century of wanting to kind of get out into the wild spaces to get away from people, but then the flip side of that is that you have to increasingly do it at night to avoid the people who are also doing it during the daytime.
Well, I think one interesting thing to sort of like start this bit with is that Stonehenge as a site, and also the landscape, Durrington Walls and Woodhenge in prehistory, and especially towards the end of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, these were places where people were coming from all over Britain and even further afield to come and be with other people. Durrington Walls is excavated by several archaeologists. I think recently by Parker Pearson has shown, big feasting and partying. So people have always been coming into here as a place of, some would say recreation, but in prehistory, this religion was very much an important part of everyday life. After a while, towards the end of the historic period and with the rise of Christianity, these sites sort of fall out of like every large scale use. And then in the 19th century, when it's mostly sort of beginning with sort of upper classes start to reconnect with archaeology and national identity, especially in the face of growing industrialization and urbanization, they start heading out to these places in search of part of their national identity, but also for recreation. And this is greatly helped by, as you mentioned, a bus service from Salisbury Station, and obviously not forgetting the railways, which get to this neck of the woods, I think, about 1840. And I know one of you had mentioned that in Dorchester itself, the railway was going to be cruising through the centre of Dorchester and affect Manbury Rings, which I think another prominent writer, William Barnes, had something to do with in terms of discussing this as well. So there was a group of people wanting to, encourage people to appreciate and look after these sites and go visit them, great, but also to be like, hold on, these are also very special places that need to be protected. I think it's like quite an interesting parallel between sort of all these people visiting these sites now and in the Victorian period, as well as way back in prehistory when people all over wanted to go to Stonehenge.
Like there's some kind of national impulse to go for a summer festival, whether it's a music festival or whether it's going to the summer solstice at Stonehenge or whether it's some prehistoric gathering to go and slaughter several cows.
It's a very appropriate time because we're doing this episode right on solstice for recording this, and also it's Glastonbury Festival where hordes of Londoners are descending upon sort of Pilton and the West Country.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing that I think Hardy brings in his work, is that sense of there are some impulses that almost bring people to act in a certain way at certain places at certain times of day. And he talks about a group of villagers who are up on top of a burial mound and they're having a bonfire for bonfire night. And he almost kind of says like there's an impulse that the same pyre that was burnt to cremate the body originally that then was interred in the burial ground is still kind of flowing through the land in some ways and kind of causing people to, without realizing it, create this bonfire in exactly the same place. And do either of you feel that at all when you're walking across the landscape, that there's almost a kind of like ghostly echo echoes that in some places just seem to gather more strongly than others?
Yeah, I think so. Some of the ancient sites that are very well preserved, like Stonehenge, if you can get there without the people, West Kennet Long Barrow, Silbury Hill, the Avebury landscape, which is still wide open, and you can find some solitude there. For me, as I move through the landscape, what I look for are the connections. You know, I look in one direction and see one ancient site, and I look into another direction and see another, and then think about how did people move through those landscapes. And then even into the more modern times, you know, I think it was Stukely who wrote about in Silbury Hill, and this would have been in the 1700s. The villagers would gather and have a tea party on top of the hill and gather the water from the local springs. And you just get a sense that whilst the sites are ancient and unknown today in terms of what their purpose was, you know, they still have a utility. There's still something that's of meaning to people that have lived there in years gone by that would have no clue what the purpose was, but still able to use it. I love that idea of going on top of Silbury Hill and setting up some tables and having a tea party.
Yeah, I think we should bring that one back, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that Jack touched upon is, dare I say, maybe we're starting to already erode Hardy's crown of being quite unusual in this particular instance, because it sounds like actually a lot of people have been going to these sites forever and ever and ever, and Hardy going in the middle of the night, much as he felt it was something special that he was cycling there and that he had this unique view, actually it sounds like it's been almost kind of something that dates back prehistorically to not just before Hardy but before even the kind of modern era.
Yeah, I think a lot of these spaces have started off as somewhere special and have remained something special. I mean, I don't want to. Hardy was, you know, pretty unique in the way that he wrote about these places and the way he would travel quite far in his age to visit some of them by his own steam on a bicycle, which again is I quite an effort.
At the age of 50 odd, yeah.
At the age, I couldn't do that at the age of 28. Other people were starting to do this at the time, and you know, this is sort of the era, the end of the 19th century is when sort of the National Trust gets founded, and the Schedule of Ancient Monuments starts with Pitt Rivers going around and recording these sites, recording these places as special places. Not just, I mean, this is mostly on their sort of historical value and what is value. These are all special to various people for various reasons, including local communities, and we don't actually hear enough of that, I think, in the historical record about how these places have been special for local people. You know, going up and having a feast or a dinner party on some ancient monument. We don't know these things, but there's quite a nice, poignant example of these special places remaining very special in sort of Hardy's Wessex in Dorset. Is Knowlton Rings, where you've got the Barrow landscape, and then, you know, before that there was the henge, and then there's a Norman church built in the middle of the henge, and even today you can go and sort of see people tying ribbons around trees, and things are remaining quite special, and I think that's very nice. It's a very nice way to appreciate these monuments, and Hardy was part of that, and you could say promoting that in his books and telling people to go and see these places at the proper time, you know.
So I think Thomas Hardy actually knew General Pitt Rivers, because there's this interview from the 1890s where he says he's being asked, actually, because there's a rumour going around that Stonehenge is going to be deported to America potentially. And so Hardy's brought in to weigh in on this and write this interview saying how appalling this would be and how significant Stonehenge is to the English people, and it's the hub of Wessex. And he says afterwards, like, I don't know why they asked me to write it, because I've written 2 pages on Stonehenge in a book called Test of the D'Urbervilles, and that's it. And I cycled there a few times. Whereas General Pitt Rivers, I think he says something like he's looked down every rabbit hole on Salisbury Plain. I find this interesting, this idea of the imaginative world versus the stories that we create around a world. And almost like you were saying about Silbury Hill and the tea party on top, and almost the tea party is kind of becomes part of that history, and that story becomes part of the grander story of Silbury Hill. And with Hardy, you know, the fact that Tess lies on the altar stone, it's almost like it reinforces the idea that the central stone was an altar stone, although I'm going to ask Jack to weigh in on that, because I'm not entirely sure if that's still current in archaeological thought, that was where human sacrifice took place, and I'm guessing no. But it's interesting how that almost kind of rewrites the whole narrative. And I was just wondering if you could give me your thoughts on how important like the historical fact is versus the stories that start to gather around it, and almost is Hardy being irresponsible by rewriting the archaeology of this site?
The first thing to just mention is that Hardy, you know, why was I asked? Hardy said, and he's next communicates. Why are we talking about him right now in relation to sort of the past and archaeology? And a lot of these, you know, he knew Pitt Rivers, but this was like a learned society where lots of people were in communication at the same time. I think the first act to protect ancient monuments was in 1882 or something. And I think one of its biggest supporters, aside from Pitt Rivers, was William Morris, the wallpaper man, and as well as many other great works of art. I know him as the wallpaper man. Hardy was part of this, learned society and an excellent communicator. So I think, his words did have value, and they might not always be the most historically accurate. The idea of human sacrifice in Iron Age Britain, it's difficult, and not to mention, a lot of people in this era would relate Stonehenge to sort of druidical worship in what we consider now the Iron Age, and these stories of human sacrifice became very popular with ancient authors, especially Caesar, almost as sort of Roman propaganda. Not to say there wasn't evidence of human sacrifice. You got bog bodies in Northern Europe that suggest so, and in Ireland, but the historical fact might not be there. But it was sort of a vague, and it sort of conformed to some of the ideas at the time. And then you get into that whole question of, well, is he being irresponsible? That sort of fact versus embellished fact or even fiction. And you could say at points, but if he's sort of reflecting some of what people believe at the period, and he's in communication with people like Pitt Rivers, and they weren't hugely denouncing him at the time, you can sort of forgive him for that. And then you get to the very difficult question that we as archaeologists face today, which is like, how do we know that what we gather, it's a much more scientific method that we use today, and we try to base our opinions more objectively on that. But it's still, and there's an element of subjectivity and interpretation. And so whilst we say we get it from the evidence, we are not the ultimate authority on the words of the past as well.
And I'm just wondering as well, like, to bring it to Glyn and all of the engagement that he's done through his podcast and through the tours that he leads across the Wiltshire landscape, do you find that, like, what level of people respond to different things? Because I think you've mentioned before there was an amazing stone about like the devil coming and drinking from a puddle in a stone, if I've remembered right. And how much do you find that the way that you relate to your audiences through these sites is through those ancient, like the archaeological drawings and stratigraphy and everything, and how much actually is the stories and that kind of almost community value that's evolved through time?
I think people are always interested in the human stories, as far as we can tell them anyway, because with prehistory, there's a lot of subjectivity, as Jack's already said. But people do want to hear the stories as they're going through the landscape. So, on some of the tours that we've done, it's been good to have someone from the Wiltshire Museum come along and bring some artifacts from the landscape and say, we found this Iron Age pottery here, and we know that there were some roundhouses here. It brings the landscape alive. But I think in terms of the Hardy side of things, I mean, that story you were just talking about, the devil drinking from the puddle, that's in relation to the Devil's Den, which Hardy did write about in a very poetic way, actually. But I think I'm ready to cut Hardy a bit of slack in terms of dramatic license. I think it's good to create stories. And the story about the devil drinking from the stone is pure folklore. Those stones at the Devil's Den were part of what used to be a Neolithic long barrow, which is now long gone. And the stones are all that remains. And they've been put up in the way that they are right now, quite artificially, I suppose, because if you look closely, you can see there's some cement holding the capstone in place. But still, it draws people. I've seen on social media this morning, somebody went up to the Devil's Den on the solstice and stayed there all night to watch the sun come up and took a photograph of the sun shining through the gap in the stones. So it still speaks to people. And I'm a lover of folklore as well. I love finding out little stories. And I like the idea of, if you stay at the Devil's Den during the dark and leave a bit of water on the top, that the devil will come out and drink it. So the next morning it will be gone. I just love little things like that. It's all, you could argue that it's silly and nonsense, but on the other hand, it just makes them a bit more alive and a bit more intriguing and a little bit more dangerous, I suppose, because it makes me think, would I want to stay around the Devil's Den in the dark? I'm not sure about that.
Oh, and it's quite interesting as well, because Hardy, this is kind of going slightly more into the kind of beliefs section of the exhibition at Wiltshire Museum. But we've got these amazing folkloric customs that Hardy recorded down about sticking pins into pigeons' hearts and burning them over a flame to curse your ex-lover, and all these interesting beliefs that people had at that time. And he says another one is the oxen, which has become quite famous because it was set to music, and it's about going on Christmas Eve down to the stables. And the Wessex belief was that on Christmas Eve at midnight, all of the animals kneel down on their knees. And the whole poem he writes, The Oxen, is about almost, I don't really want to go just in case it's not true. And while I haven't gone, I can kind of still believe that it might actually have happened. And I think that's the wonderful thing about these sites, like you say about with the devil, is I almost don't want to go and spend the night, because then I know it's definitely not true. Whereas before, unless I have spent the night, I can just kind of still keep on saying, well, it might. Who knows?
I think there's another thing which is nice about, when you read about these things in Hardy. I mean, because one of the things I did a year or so ago was I went up to Stonehenge and I had Tess open in front of me and read that passage. Reading something on the page is one thing, but then to sort of connect it with the real landscape as well is sort of brings it alive. But yeah, you want to do it in a way that doesn't kill it off, if you see what I mean. So going to Stonehenge at a time during the day when it's full of tourists might not have been the same experience trying to read Tess at that point compared to going in the evening when I had it to myself. But it's about keeping the stories alive in your own mind. I think that's really valuable.
And the other thing I just quite liked was I think you said back at the beginning about the way you travel to these places, and also being able to see them in relation to each other, seeing like the walking routes that people would have taken, and especially for a community and a society that was basically travelling on foot the whole length and breadth of the country. And I think that's an interesting thing I find with Hardy's characters when they are travelling these distances, is quite often they're on foot. And he specifically describes Tess approaching Stonehenge and they're just cutting across country and they completely by chance bump into Stonehenge. And the difference of approaching somewhere like that on foot or by bicycle versus coming in the car, parking in the car park, getting in the little shuttle bus, or arriving on your train in 1895 and getting on the charabanc. And
yeah, definitely. I mean, I can definitely say without a shadow of a doubt that the Stonehenge experience is completely different if you rock up to the car park and take the bus and just walk around the stones and then go back, compared to doing what I do is tend to park over by Durrington and walk the mile or two through the landscape, across the Cursus and then up the hill. And it just is so present in the distance. That's a totally different way to experience Stonehenge, and maybe a bit more aligned to how it was meant to be seen and meant to be experienced. That's just me guessing, I suppose, but it just gave me a very emotional connection to that landscape when I was doing the walk that way. Very different to my first initial experience of Stonehenge, which was to, in the old days, park in the car park, go through the tunnel underneath the road, and then sort of walk around it with the hordes and see the traffic on the A303 going to Cornwall. It's it's not a very nice experience doing it that way.
No. Well, that's a big recommendation then for anyone who wants to approach Stonehenge in Tesla d'Urberville's very boots, as it were, is parking 2 miles away and approaching on foot. And I think that's an interesting one as well, about kind of, obviously one big thing that's changed about the way that we access these sites now is when Hardy was first looking at Stonehenge, barely anyone knew about it. It was completely open to people. The owner, who was a big advocate of the spab protection methods, so he really wanted to basically just leave Stonehenge to kind of subside, as I understand it, as he felt would naturally happen. And that all changes just after Tess has been published. One of the lintels falls off, I think, and that causes everyone to get a bit worried and think that it needs a bit more structural integrity to it. And then that's when they start putting fences around it. And so for the first time, you can't just go and wander amongst the stones. But that's one of the wonderful thing about a lot of the other sites that Thomas Hardy talks about, like Maiden Castle, like the Devil's Den, like Rainbarrow, is that they are still kind of accessible to just be able to go and walk into them and walk amongst them. And that sense of it being very, very much unchanged from how it was, which I think we've kind of touched upon before when we've talked, Jack especially, is about that access and access versus preservation.
Yeah, and I suppose it sort of depends on the monument and the site, because a lot of these places, they are out in the sort of, not sticks, but like in the countryside, and don't have the infrastructure for loads of people to sort of bolt in and go visit. And people like, as in Hardy's day, walking up to these monuments would have a very sort of minimal impact on their preservation. Once these things become more popular, as Stonehenge is an example, certain infrastructure requirements are needed and more preservation is required to sort of maintain them, because at the end of the day, conservation in terms of ancient monuments is constantly managing change. These monuments are never static, they're always changing. And it's an interesting point you made about like how these would have been. These monuments have changed massively over millennia. Maiden Castle would have had palisades all over it and people inside and cattle, and it might have smelled awful. And it's very, very different now. But these are cultural resources, and although they have changed, they still lock in many secrets there, evidence of how people were in the past. And it is very important to try and maintain them. And every time a small bit of damage occurs, we lose a bit of it. So it is very difficult, but you don't want to restrict people from going to see them at all. And going for a walk in the countryside, walking up to these monuments is a great way to experience them. It just needs to be, if you visit these places, you just need to take them with care. They are sort of precious. They might seem like huge lumps of rock and been them for millennia. So it's all right. I can scrabble up something or take a bit, but don't look after them. They're very precious. But the whole point of them, okay, they tell us about people of the past, but there is a very real point, as Hardy was himself and promoting, is experiencing them, that they can be for recreation. There's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, I would say absolutely that's part of what they're there for. They're our connection with ourselves and with literature, with art, and they're there to be enjoyed as well.
Yeah, I think that's maybe, if I'm going to start waving the Hardy flag again, I think that's maybe what I like about the way that he presents these ancient sites, is that he seems to appreciate the history of them. In his own site, Max Gate, when he was digging the foundations for his home, he actually found a Neolithic sarsen stone from a Neolithic enclosure. And he also found some Romano-British pottery and also a brooch and also a pair of skeletons that were believed to be Bronze Age. And so he kind of understood that side of things as well. He liked digging up the remains and having a kind of semi-scientific archaeological approach to them. He at least, wrote it up in the proceedings afterwards for the local museum. So he tried. But I think what I like about him is that he seems to then get that balance, that it is about the human story as well. It's about the kind of magic and the humanity that you kind of weave back around these things and connecting them across the ways that people have used them right throughout ages and ages and ages. So yeah, I think that's, if I'm going to wave my Hardy flag, that's what I think he does very, very well, is getting that balance.
And absolutely, and I think so too. And if you look at a landscape and see a barrow and someone tells you, well, that's a barrow, it's Bronze Age, and just leaves it at that, it's not very exciting, is it? And to have these people like Hardy promote these monuments and give them life and texture, I think is incredibly valuable, not just for enjoying them, but for preserving them. It makes them more special. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I suppose it's only through giving something value that we can then go on to preserve it. And through his works, he kind of helps give it that value that hopefully makes people want to preserve it in future. A bit like the article that he did that interview for. It's really Tesla d'Urberville's that has engaged people so much with Stonehenge being such an iconic site that kind of almost made it a bit of a literary celebrity in itself at that point, which then was as strong an argument to saving it from being deported to America as if they'd got General Pitt Rivers himself to come and talk about it.
Yeah, and I think in a very sort of like practical sense, if a monument's been written by Hardy and it's got that extra dimension of sort of cultural importance that we're talking about it now, it's all the more special.
Okay, so I'm now going to play devil's advocate for a while, because I think we've given Hardy quite a good run so far, and I think he's done quite well. But just to throw one more spanner in the works, there is a short story called Tryst on an Ancient Earthwork, and it talks about an archaeologist who has asked the narrator, unnamed first-person narrator, to meet him up on Maiden Castle in the middle of the night. And it's a really, really dark, stormy night and horrible, filthy night to be out. And so the narrator goes up to the top of Maiden Castle and finds his friend, the archaeologist, digging on I think it's meant to be the Roman temple right on top of Maiden Castle, and finds amongst the things, I think it's meant to be a bronze statue of Mercury. And he basically is saying, they didn't give me permission to dig, but, what's it going to hurt if I just go and prove that my theory is right by going and digging this tiny, tiny micro trench on this Roman temple. And I think the narrator then says that the archaeologist puts everything back in the hole, except he doesn't remember seeing the statue of Mercury go back in the hole. And then the short story tantalizingly finishes with the idea that I think he says something about the statue of Mercury coincidentally just turning up at the museum one day. And so obviously this is a completely fictional short story by an unknown first-person narrator about a completely fictional place in an alternative universe. But I was just wondering, do you feel that something like this potentially could actually be quite a damaging story to put about?
What a wonderful heist story. I mean, that's sort of out of the Indiana Jones book of archaeology, of going to somewhere and pinching something for the museum. Well, just as a disclaimer, if you did that today and like on Maiden Castle, you'd go to prison. It's a scheduled monument. That's very much against, well, maybe not prison. You'd probably be fined, but it's very much against the law to do that kind of thing. And promoting people to get involved in archaeology, of course, I'm all for But there are laws about this and certain rules to follow. As I mentioned, these are precious things, and anything you do that takes away from them, you can never recover. So although the mysterious archaeologist put everything back, he's dug through a context, a sealed layer in the ground that over time has built up, and there's information we can get out of that. We can date different phases of buildings through different contexts or different actions at a site. Maybe someone did a little votive deposit to put a statue of Mercury in. We wouldn't know that if they've sort of just bundled all the earth together without context recording and just wedged it back in. That's not good practice. I would shame Hardy for that. But mysterious narrator, so maybe we could give him a pass. I don't know.
Yeah, and the mysterious narrator, I think, was slightly judgmental about what was going on. The mysterious narrator still appears in a published short story that obviously is then being promoted internationally. And obviously there may be some people who side with the mysterious narrator, but there may be other people who think that actually digging up a Mercury statue on Maiden Castle sounds like a bit of fast cash.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a difficult debate that we face in archaeology today. As I say, there are laws, but people will have different viewpoints on those laws. And especially, in the landscape around Stonehenge and around archaeological sites, detectoring is quite popular, and there are actually proper means to do this. There's laws you have to follow. You have to have a legal agreement with the landowner, and it's very good practice to record this with the Portable Antiquities Scheme. So the information that you gain from finding these objects is not completely lost. It's a wobbly bridge, and we love finding out new stuff, but then there's also what you lose, which is quite important.
So Thomas Hardy has done really, really well so far. I think Hardy has won in terms of how he presented archaeology and certainly ancient sites to the public in a way that really kind of engaged hearts and minds with those ancient sites. And as Glyn says, with going and visiting Devil's Den today, people still get that feeling of there having been something special that's happened in these places, and that sense of kind of wanting to gather together there, as we still see with Stonehenge's summer solstice. But where Hardy potentially does just need a little bit of a kind of nudge is not to be promoting digging up ancient sites without recording things properly. So definitely not that. But I'm going to say this is a kind of 50-50 for Hardy at the end of this episode. Thank you so much for joining me to thrash this out together.
No, it was good fun. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Interrogating Hardy. Special thanks go out to our sponsors, Batten Solicitors, as well as our funders, Arts Council for England and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Make sure to subscribe here if you want to catch future episodes.